The autumn of 1884 brought with it a peculiar commission that would in time reveal itself to be far more than a matter of pipes and porcelain. Our craftsman, let us observe him closely, for he deserves our attention, had spent the better part of 2 decades perfecting his trade in the emerging world of modern sanitation. The morning of October 15th found him in his workshop on Borough High Street, surrounded by the gleaming brass fittings and lead joints that were transforming London from medieval squalor into something approaching civilized comfort. He was examining a new patent valve, marveling at its precision, when young Timothy, the telegraph boy, burst through the door with an urgent message. The address alone, number 17 Belgrave Square, caused our man to set down his tools with particular care. One did not receive summons to such addresses every day, and when one did, it paid to arrive properly prepared. The journey from Southwark to Belgravia might have been measured in mere miles, but truly it traversed entire worlds. As his omnibus rattled across Westminster Bridge, he observed how the very air seemed to change, growing somehow cleaner and more rarefied with each street crossed. The crowds thinned from the pressing throngs of workers to the measured pace of gentility. Even the horses seemed to step more delicately on Belgravia's swept cobblestones. Number 17 stood like a Gothic poem written in stone and iron, its revival architecture speaking of new money trying to purchase old respectability. The mansion rose 4 stories, crowned with elaborate chimney stacks that twisted toward the gray October sky. Our craftsman counted no fewer than 12 windows facing the square, each one tall enough to require a footman's ladder to clean properly. He made these calculations automatically, his mind already mapping potential pipe routes through walls that likely hadn't been disturbed since the Prince Regent was young. The tradesman's entrance, naturally, lay around the side, down a set of worn steps that countless delivery men had polished with their passing. Here waited Mr. Pemberton, a butler of such archetypal bearing that he might have stepped from the pages of a household management manual. Yet something in his eyes, a flicker of recognition perhaps, suggested he too knew what it meant to work with his hands. "Punctual," Pemberton noted with approval, consulting a pocket watch that had seen better decades. "Her ladyship appreciates punctuality above all virtues, save cleanliness." The butler led him through the servants' domain first, a necessary courtesy that allowed our craftsman to understand the house's hidden circulation. Through the kitchen, where cook barely glanced up from her pastry-making, past the pantry where a young housemaid was polishing silver with such vigor that her cap had gone askew. This was Alice, though our craftsman wouldn't learn her name until later, and even then only because she would prove more observant than most gave her credit for. "Her ladyship," Pemberton explained as they climbed the servants' stairs, "has particular requirements regarding the installation. She has read extensively about the healthful benefits of proper bathing, perhaps too extensively, if you take my meaning." The butler's tone remained perfectly neutral, yet our craftsman heard the weariness of a man who had endured many enthusiasms. The bathroom space itself occupied what had once been a dressing room adjacent to Lady Ashworth's chambers. The room had already been partially prepared, old wallpaper stripped, floorboards reinforced. Yet it waited like an empty stage for its principal player. Pemberton produced a set of architectural drawings, unfolding them with the ceremony due to sacred texts. "The bathtub has been ordered from Shanks of Glasgow," he intoned. "Finest Carrara marble, arriving next week. The water closet will be a Twyford's Unitas. Her ladyship insists on the very latest model. Hot and cold running water, naturally, with sufficient pressure for the second floor. A craftsman studied the plans, his practiced eye already identifying challenges. The house's original plumbing, installed perhaps 20 years prior for basic kitchen use, would need substantial modification. More concerning was the distance from the main water supply. Pressure would indeed be an issue. Yet these were puzzles he lived to solve, the very reason his reputation had spread through careful whispers among the better houses. "I'll need to inspect the existing system," he said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of expertise. "From cellar to attic, if you please." As Pemberton led him through the house's vertical maze, our craftsman glimpsed the family's life in fragments. Through a door left ajar, he saw a young man. This would be Edmund Ashworth, sprawled in a chair, sketching desultorily while surrounded by the expensive detritus of an artistic temperament. In another room, a woman's voice dictated correspondence in measured tones. Margaret Thornley, the paid companion, though her bearing suggested education beyond her station. The attic proved most intriguing. Beneath the Gothic eaves lay not just the expected servants' quarters, but also a peculiar assembly of mechanical antiquities. An old cistern, lead-lined and vast, occupied one corner, a relic from when the house collected rainwater for washing. Our craftsman ran his fingers along the pipes, feeling their stories through temperature and vibration. Someone had modified this system recently, though not with professional skill. Fresh scratches on the valve handles told of frequent use, yet Pemberton claimed this system had been abandoned years ago. "Curious," our craftsman murmured, though he kept his deeper observations to himself. In houses like this, curiosity needed to be balanced with discretion. Alice appeared in the doorway, having climbed the stairs on some errand. She glanced at the cistern, then at him, and something passed across her face. Not quite fear, but certainly unease. 3 days had passed since that initial survey, and our craftsman had thrown himself into the work with the particular satisfaction that comes from tackling a worthy challenge. The marble bathtub had arrived from Scotland as promised, a magnificent thing, carved from a single block of Carrara, so heavy it had taken 6 men and a specially reinforced hoist to maneuver it through the windows. Lady Ashworth had watched the operation from her bedroom doorway, wringing her hands and consulting a medical journal about the dangers of sudden exertion on the heart. The morning of October 18th dawned crisp and bright, one of those autumn days that makes London almost forget its usual shroud of coal smoke. Our craftsman had arrived early, before the household properly stirred, to complete the final connections. The copper pipes gleamed like fresh pennies where they emerged from the wall, each joint soldered with the precision of a jeweler setting stones. He tested the taps. Hot and cold ran clear and strong. The pressure problems solved through an ingenious arrangement of secondary pumps and check valves. Lady Ashworth appeared at precisely 10 o'clock, flanked by Margaret Thornley and Dr. Headley, who had been summoned for this momentous occasion. Her ladyship moved with the careful deliberation of someone who believed her body to be made of spun glass. She was a handsome woman still, though anxiety had etched permanent lines around her eyes and mouth. Her fingers clutched a bottle of smelling salts as though it were a talisman against unseen dangers. "The water must be precisely 98 degrees, she instructed, consulting a thermometer she produced from her pocket. Dr. Liebermeister's research clearly indicates that variations of even 2 degrees can produce palpitations or worse. Margaret Thornley stood ready with towels and various bottles of therapeutic salts. her expression maintaining that perfect neutrality required of those who serve the nervously inclined. Dr. Headley, a man whose patience had been worn smooth by decades of such scenes, nodded gravely at each of Lady Ashworth's medical pronouncements, while catching our craftsman's eye with the faintest suggestion of weary amusement. The tub filled slowly, steam rising like morning mist over the Thames. Lady Ashworth tested the temperature repeatedly, added precise measurements of Epsom salts, and finally, with great ceremony, prepared for her inaugural bath. The men naturally withdrew, though Dr. Headley remained within calling distance, seated in the adjoining room with his medical bag at hand. Our craftsman was packing his tools in the corridor when the scream erupted, not a shriek of pain, but of pure existential horror. He rushed back to find Lady Ashworth standing beside the tub, pointing at the water with a trembling finger. Where moments before had been clear, steaming water, there now swirled a faint but unmistakable tinge of pink, like diluted wine, or, as Lady Ashworth insisted between gasps, blood. "It's an omen!" she cried, clutching at Dr. Headley's sleeve. "The house knows! It knows about Italy, about my journey. This is a warning." The doctor administered laudanum drops, while Margaret attempted to calm her mistress with practical observations. "Perhaps it's merely rust, my lady. Old pipes often—" "Rust does not appear suddenly." Lady Ashworth's voice rose to a pitch that brought Edmund from his studio, still holding a paintbrush. "The water was clear, perfectly clear, and then— Our craftsman knelt beside the tub, professional pride warring with confusion. He had installed everything new, every pipe, every joint, every fitting. He dipped his finger in the water, brought it to his nose. There was indeed something beyond the usual metallic tang of London water, something organic, almost algal. His mind raced through possibilities while maintaining an exterior calm that seemed to reassure even Lady Ashworth. "I'll lead to inspect the entire system," he announced with quiet authority. "There may be sediment from the initial installation. These things can sometimes take a few cycles to clear." Edmund watched from the doorway with an expression our craftsman couldn't quite read. Concern, certainly, but something else too. "Mother's nerves," he said, as though that explained everything. "This Italian nonsense has quite overtaxed her." The Italian journey, our craftsman had heard fragments about it during his work. Lady Ashworth planned to take the waters at Montecatini, convinced they would cure her various ailments. Edmund's tone suggested he viewed this plan with considerable skepticism, though whether from concern for his mother's health or some other motivation remained unclear. While Dr. Headley escorted Lady Ashworth to her bedroom for a restorative rest, our craftsman began his investigation. He traced every pipe from tub to boiler, from boiler to main supply. Everything ran clear when tested individually. Yet when he returned to the bathroom and ran the taps again, there it was, that faint pink tinge, appearing after perhaps 30 seconds of flow. Margaret Thornley found him there, staring at the water, with the intensity of a fortune teller reading tea leaves. "It's very distressing for her ladyship," she said softly. "She's been planning this journey for months, reading every medical journal, corresponding with continental doctors. She truly believes the waters there will help her condition." "And what condition would that be, precisely?" our craftsman asked, though he suspected he knew. The wealthy, in his experience, often suffered from ailments that poverty would never permit. Margaret's smile held both sympathy and resignation. The condition of having too much time to contemplate one's mortality, I suspect. though you didn't hear that from me." There was something in her manner, intelligence certainly, but also a weariness that seemed premature for her years. Our craftsman found himself wondering about her story, how an educated woman came to be reading medical journals aloud to a hypochondriac. But such wonderings were dangerous in houses like this, where the boundaries between classes were marked as clearly as property lines. He returned to his investigation with renewed focus. The valve configurations in the basement were as he'd left them, but something nagged at him. Those scratches on the attic cistern's valves, fresh marks on abandoned equipment. On impulse, he climbed back to the attic, this time alone. The late afternoon sun slanted through the dusty windows, illuminating the old cistern like a stage effect. He traced the pipes leading from it, followed their path through the walls, and there, almost hidden behind a newer installation, he found it. A junction, recently modified, that connected the old rainwater system to his new plumbing. The valve was closed now, but the handle showed signs of recent use. The October 21st morning brought with it a thick fog that transformed Belgrave Square into something from a Gothic novel, which seemed entirely appropriate given what our craftsman had discovered. He arrived early, carrying a collection of specialized tools and a coal oil lantern that would prove essential for examining the darker corners of the mansion's architectural secrets. Pemberton met him at the servants' entrance with unusual promptness, as though he too sensed that matters had taken a turn beyond the merely mechanical. The attic had become our craftsman's primary concern. In the gray morning light filtering through grimy windows, the space revealed itself as a museum of the house's hydratic evolution. The massive lead-lined cistern dominated one corner like a slumbering beast, its riveted seams speaking of an era when craftsmen signed their work with pride. He ran his hands along its surface, feeling the stories held within the metal. Decades of rain collected from the slate roof, stored for washing and cleaning in times when water came dear. Opening the cistern's access hatch required a wrench and considerable effort. The hinges protested with a groan that seemed to echo through the house's bones. Inside, the beam of his lantern revealed a primordial soup, rust-red sediment layered like geological strata, and floating on the surface, a carpet of crimson algae that had found in this forgotten darkness the perfect conditions to flourish. The smell that escaped was organic, fecund, unmistakably the source of Lady Ashworth's terror. "Fascinating, isn't it?" Margaret Thornley's voice came from the stairway. She approached with a confidence that suggested she'd navigated these upper reaches before. "I've been reading about such growths in the household management journals. Rhodophyta, they call it. Red algae. Thrives in darkness and stand in water." Our craftsman looked at her with new interest. Here was education beyond what her position required, knowledge sought for its own sake rather than mere utility. She wore a practical gray dress, her hair pulled back severely, yet there was something in her bearing that suggested she hadn't always occupied this intermediate position between servant and family. "The previous owner was quite the amateur engineer," she continued, gesturing at the various pipes and valves. "Lord Pembroke, no relation to our Pemberton despite the similarity. He installed all this himself, or so the household records indicate. Believed in self-sufficiency, storing rainwater against some imagined siege of London." Together they traced the system's anatomy. Pipes ran like veins through the walls, some properly brazed, others connected with amateur enthusiasm but professional incompetence. Our craftsman's trained eye spotted modifications upon modifications, each generation of improvement creating new complications. Most intriguing was that recently altered junction. Someone had deliberately created a pathway between old and new, but with a subtlety that suggested knowledge of both systems. "Who else knows about these connections?" he asked, watching Margaret's face carefully. She hesitated, then answered with careful precision. "The household records are available to anyone who cares to look, though I confess I'm perhaps the only one who reads them for pleasure. Edmund finds them tedious, and Lady Ashworth concerns herself only with the future, never the past." They descended to the second floor, where our craftsman needed to trace the path from cistern to bathroom. This required entering portions of the house usually forbidden to tradesmen. The family's private quarters, where Persian carpets, muffled footsteps, and portraits of stern ancestors watched from gilded frames. Edmund's studio door stood open, the man himself absent, but his presence lingering in the smell of linseed oil and turpentine. Canvases leaned against walls, most turned backward, though one visible painting showed a woman drowning in what appeared to be a sea of red. Artistic metaphor, or something more literal? In the bathroom, our craftsman conducted a series of tests with the methodical patience that separated true craftsmen from mere workers. He opened taps in sequence, timing the flow, watching for the exact moment when clear turned to pink. 28 seconds with hot water alone, 35 with cold, 31 with both running. The consistency suggested not random contamination, but deliberate action. Someone who knew precisely how long it took for water to travel from cistern to tub. Alice appeared with fresh towels, moving with the practiced invisibility of good service. Yet our craftsman noticed how her eyes flickered to the tub, then to the walls, as though she could see through them to the pipes beyond. "Begging your pardon, sir," she said quietly, "but I've noticed something odd. The sounds in the walls, water running when no one's using the taps. Always late evening, just before her ladyship's bedtime bath." Here was valuable intelligence, delivered with the careful indirection of a servant who knew the dangers of speaking too plainly. Our craftsman nodded his thanks, filing away this information while maintaining the expression of a man concerned only with water pressure and joint integrity. Pemberton found them there, his arrival preceded by the dignified rhythm of his footsteps. "Her ladyship wishes to know when the matter will be resolved," he announced, though something in his tone suggested he knew this was more than a simple mechanical failure. "The Italian departure is planned for November 10th, and she grows increasingly anxious." The butler's pause before anxious spoke volumes. Our craftsman had seen enough of Lady Ashworth to understand that anxiety was her natural state, carefully cultivated and maintained like a delicate orchid. Yet this crimson water had transformed manageable nervousness into something approaching genuine terror. She saw omens in it, warnings against her journey, perhaps even threats to her life. "I'll need to seal the old system completely," our craftsman announced, his plan crystallizing. "Remove any possibility of contamination. But first, I must understand all the connections, document every valve and junction." Margaret produced a household ledger, its pages filled with neat copperplate recording years of repairs and modifications. Together, they pieced together the mansion's hydraulic history, the original Georgian well, the Victorian cistern system, the modern water company connection. Each era had left its mark, creating a palimpsest of pipes that required archaeology as much as engineering to understand. As afternoon faded into evening, our craftsman made a curious discovery. Hidden behind a false panel in the bathroom wall was a valve he hadn't installed, one that didn't appear on any plan. It was new, the brass still bright, the connections professionally done. Someone with skill had added this after his initial installation, but before Lady Ashworth's first bath. Someone who understood both plumbing and the psychology of fear. By October 24th, our craftsman had developed the habits of a detective without quite realizing his transformation. He arrived each morning with his tools, certainly, but also with a small notebook in which he recorded observations that had little to do with water pressure or pipe dimensions. The pattern was becoming clear to him now, like a photograph emerging in a developing bath, though proving it would require patience and considerable delicacy. The crimson water appeared with disturbing regularity, always in the evening, always when Lady Ashworth was discussing her Italian journey. The previous night, she had been reviewing her itinerary with Dr. Headley, describing the therapeutic regime she would follow at Montecatini, when Margaret had drawn her bath. Within moments, the telltale pink had appeared, sending her ladyship into such fits that the doctor had been obliged to administer a stronger dose of laudanum than usual. Our craftsman had taken to marking the pipes with tiny scratches, invisible to casual observation, but clear enough to his trained eye. These marks told a story of manipulation. Valves turned, just enough to allow the contaminated water from the cistern to mix with the clean supply, then carefully return to their original positions. Whoever was doing this understood the system intimately, knew exactly which combinations would produce the desired effect. This morning found him in conversation with Pemberton in the butler's pantry, a space that occupied the neutral ground between upstairs and downstairs. The butler was polishing silver with mechanical precision, his hands performing the familiar task while his mind clearly dwelt elsewhere. 43 years in service, Pemberton mused apropos of nothing. Started as a hall boy when her ladyship's father was still master here. Seen 3 generations come and go, each with their peculiarities. Our craftsman recognized this as an invitation to listen rather than speak. He occupied himself checking the pressure gauges he'd installed throughout the house, allowing Pemberton the comfort of apparent solitude for his revelations. Master Edmund, the butler continued, was such a promising boy. Oxford material, his tutors said. But then his father passed when he was 16, and her ladyship, well, she couldn't bear to let him go. Kept him close, too close, perhaps. A young man needs to make his own way in the world, not be kept like a songbird in a cage. Through the window they could see Edmund in the garden, ostensibly sketching but actually staring at nothing, his hands idle. There was something tragic about him, our craftsman thought. A man of 26 who had never been allowed to truly grow up, trapped between his mother's fears and his own frustrated ambitions. Alice entered with a tea tray, setting it down with particular care. As she turned to leave, she paused near our craftsman. Miss Thornley asked if you could examine the pipes in the library when you have a moment, sir. She says there's been an odd sound. There was no odd sound in the library, of course. Instead, Margaret Thornley waited among the leather-bound volumes, with a ledger our craftsman hadn't seen before, a household account book that told its own disturbing story. Edmund's debts were mounting: tailors, wine merchants, and most troublingly, several entries that suggested gambling losses, poorly disguised as social obligations. "I shouldn't be showing you this," Margaret said quietly, her fingers nervous on the pages. "But I believe you've already surmised that our crimson water isn't entirely natural." Our craftsman studied the figures, his mind calculating.
The Italian journey would cost Lady Ashworth nearly £300, money that would otherwise go toward settling Edmund's debts. If she were declared mentally incompetent, however, control of the estate would pass to her son. The crimson water, the omens, the growing hysteria, it all pointed toward a campaign to prevent her departure, or worse, to question her sanity. "You care for him," our craftsman observed, watching Margaret's face flush. "I care for the family," she corrected, though her eyes betrayed her. "Edmund is brilliant, but broken. His mother's love is a prison, but it's also his only security. He doesn't know how to be anything other than what she's made him." They were interrupted by footsteps in the corridor. Edmund himself, moving with the careful gait of someone who'd been drinking at luncheon. He paused in the doorway, his eyes narrowing as he took in the scene. His mother's companion and the tradesman, heads bent together over private documents. "Conducting research, Miss Thornley?" His tone was light, but there was an edge beneath it. "I wasn't aware plumbing required such literary consultation." Margaret closed the ledger smoothly. "I was showing our craftsmen the household records regarding the original plumbing installation. Historical context can be quite valuable in understanding current problems." Edmund's gaze shifted to our craftsman, and for a moment something like recognition passed between them, not of each other personally, but of their respective positions in this elaborate dance. Here was a man who knew he was suspected, just as our craftsman knew he was investigating. The question was what each would do with that knowledge. "Mother is resting," Edmund announced. "Another episode this morning. The water ran pink just as she was discussing train schedules with Cook. Quite remarkable timing, wouldn't you say?" The challenge in his voice was unmistakable. Our craftsman met his gaze steadily, allowing silence to do the work of words. In his experience, guilty men often convicted themselves through excessive explanation, and Edmund seemed the type to fill uncomfortable quiet with revealing speech. "Perhaps," our craftsman said finally, "someone should remain with the valve controls during her ladyship's bath times, to observe any fluctuations in pressure or unusual behavior in the system." Edmund's laugh was bitter. "Yes, post a guard over the pipes. I'm sure Mother would find that tremendously reassuring. Nothing says safe and normal household quite like sentries in the basement." He departed with studied casualness, but our craftsman noticed he headed not to his studio, but toward the servants' stairs that led to the attic. Margaret watched him go, her expression a complex mixture of love, pity, and something approaching despair. That evening, our craftsman implemented his observation plan, but with subtlety that would have impressed a Pinkerton detective. He installed small telltales on each valve, tiny pieces of thread that would break if the handles were turned, invisible unless one knew where to look. He also created a detailed map of the entire system, marking every possible point where the old and new systems could interact. The morning of October 27th arrived wrapped in one of those particular London fogs that turn familiar streets into labyrinths and make every gas lamp a lighthouse in a yellow sea.
Our craftsman walked from Southwark across Waterloo Bridge, unable to see the Thames below, but hearing its ancient voice echoing through the murk. The fog seemed appropriate for what he was beginning to understand about the Ashworth household. Nothing was quite as it appeared on the surface. He had spent the previous evening in his modest lodgings, studying his notes by candlelight like a scholar, parsing ancient texts. The telltales he'd placed on the valves had revealed a fascinating pattern. The manipulation occurred not randomly but with precision, always between 7 and 8 in the evening, always when the household was occupied with dinner preparations. Someone was using the natural chaos of that hour as cover for their work. This morning, however, brought an unexpected development. A letter waited for him at the servants' entrance, delivered by the morning post, but addressed in a hand he hadn't seen in over a year. The solicitor, handling his late wife's affairs, had located the deed to her burial plot. It seemed the cemetery had been seeking payment for perpetual care, a detail that had somehow escaped notice during the blur of grief that had followed her passing from consumption 2 winters ago. Pemberton noticed his distraction. "Bad news, I hope not." The butler's tone suggested genuine concern rather than mere courtesy. "Old business," our craftsman replied, folding the letter carefully into his waistcoat pocket. "The kind that waits until you can least afford to address it." The butler nodded with the understanding of a man who had his own carefully buried griefs. They stood for a moment in that particular solidarity of working men who had lost much, but continued on because that's what one did. Alice interrupted their silence, appearing with that gift for sudden materialization that good servants cultivate. "Begging your pardon, Mr. Pemberton, but her ladyship is asking for the craftsman. She's in the morning room with Master Edmund." The morning room faced east, though the fog rendered such orientation meaningless today. Lady Ashworth sat in a wing-backed chair like a queen holding court, her son standing behind her in an arrangement that suggested a formal portrait. The similarity of their features was striking. The same high cheekbones, the same nervous energy about the eyes, though what appeared as anxiety in the mother manifested as barely suppressed anger in the son. "My physician has written to his colleague in Florence," Lady Ashworth announced without preamble. "He confirms that the waters at Montecatini would be beneficial for my condition. Yet how can I travel when my own house seems determined to warn me against it? The crimson water appears precisely when I make any plans. It's as though the very walls are trying to speak." Edmund's hand tightened on the back of her chair. "Mother, you're being melodramatic. It's a plumbing issue, nothing more." "Plumbing issues don't time themselves to one's conversations." Her voice rose to that pitch that suggested hysteria was imminent. "Last night, I merely mentioned to Margaret that I should book my hotel, and within minutes, the water ran red." Our craftsman observed them both carefully. Lady Ashworth's fear seemed genuine, but there was something performative about it too, as though she'd rehearsed these reactions so often they'd become automatic. Edmund, meanwhile, watched his mother with an expression that mingled frustration with something darker. Not quite hatred, but certainly resentment aged into something poisonous. "I've identified the source of the contamination," our craftsman said carefully. "The old cistern system. It can be permanently sealed, but the work will require several days and considerable disruption to the household." "Do it," Lady Ashworth commanded, "whatever it takes. I will not have my journey ruined by supernatural warnings or natural contamination or whatever this is."
Edmund's jaw tightened. The expense, Mother, can be borne more easily than the expense of my declining health, she snapped. Or would you prefer I remain here, growing ever more nervous, requiring ever more medical attention? The threat in her words was subtle but clear. Our craftsman recognized the weaponization of illness, the way hypochondria could become a tool of control. These two were locked in a battle of wills that had probably been raging since Edmund's father died, each using whatever weapons came to hand. Later, in the kitchen, Cook provided unexpected intelligence while our craftsman checked the pipes beneath her sink. "That Miss Thornley," she said, kneading bread with violent efficiency. "She's got a good head on her shoulders. Shame she's gotten tangled up with Master Edmund. Oh, don't look surprised. Servants see everything, even if we pretend blindness. She thinks she can save him, poor fool. As if anyone could save someone who doesn't want saving." The afternoon brought a series of discoveries that complicated the picture further. In the attic, our craftsman found evidence that someone had been there recently. Fresh oil on the cistern's access hatch hinges, suggesting regular opening. More intriguingly, he discovered a small notebook wedged behind a pipe, filled with calculations in Edmund's hand. Not gambling debts as he'd expected, but something else. Careful tallies of his mother's medical expenses, her planned travel costs, and projections of the estate's value if certain conditions were met. Margaret found him there as the day was dying, the fog outside the windows now tinged orange by the gas lamps. She looked exhausted, her usually perfect composure cracked enough to show the strain beneath. "She's getting worse," Margaret said simply. "The fear is consuming her. Dr. Headley increased her laudanum again, but that only makes her more confused, more susceptible to suggestion." "And Edmund?" our craftsman asked. Margaret's silence was answer enough. They stood together in the dusty attic, surrounded by the mechanical evidence of human ingenuity and folly, while below them, a household teetered on the edge of something irreversible. "I found employment elsewhere," she said suddenly. "A position as governess to a manufacturer's children in Manchester. I leave at month's end, regardless of what happens here." Our craftsman heard the resolution in her voice, but also the grief. She was choosing survival over whatever doomed attachment she'd formed to Edmund. It was the choice of a practical woman, but that didn't make it easier. As he prepared to leave that evening, Alice slipped him a note. "From my brother," she whispered. "He's looking for work, has experience in service. If you know anyone." The hope in her eyes reminded him that while the Ashworths played their elaborate games, real people with real needs moved around them, dependent on the stability of houses like this for their own survival. October 30th brought unseasonable warmth to London, the kind of false summer that makes October forget it should be preparing for winter. Our craftsman arrived at Belgrave Square to find the household in unusual agitation. Trunks had appeared in the entrance hall like leather mountains, each one labeled with Lady Ashworth's initials and destination markers for the continental journey. The lady herself stood in the morning room, directing the packing with the intensity of a general planning a campaign. Maps of Italy spread across every surface, marked with colored pins indicating hospitals, physicians, and therapeutic establishments. Margaret Thornley sat at a writing desk, composing letters of introduction to various medical authorities, while Edmund lounged in the doorway, his presence dark as a storm cloud. The departure remained set for November 10th, Lady Ashworth announced to the room at large, though her words seemed directed at her son. Nothing, not omens, not crimson water, not nervous speculation, will prevent it. Our craftsman had come to recognize this tone, defiance masquerading as determination. The more frightened Lady Ashworth became, the more stridently she insisted on her plans. It was as though she believed that by speaking her intentions loudly enough, she could overcome whatever forces seemed aligned against her. Dr. Headley arrived for his morning consultation, his medical bag heavy with the glass bottles that clinked like wind chimes as he walked. Our craftsman, working on pipes in the adjacent parlor, could hear their conversation through the walls. The thin Georgian plaster had never been designed for privacy. The waters at Monte contain significant mineral content, the doctor was explaining. Sulfates, carbonates, traces of iron. Some claim miraculous cures, though I suspect the change of air and rest from domestic concerns provide most of the benefit. Domestic concerns. Edmund's voice dripped acid. Yes, Mother has so many of those, managing her fortune, directing her household, controlling her son's future. The silence that followed was sharp enough to cut. Our craftsman found himself holding his breath, wrench suspended mid-turn. Perhaps, Dr. Headley suggested diplomatically, we should discuss your mother's treatment privately, Mr. Ashworth. Their footsteps retreated, but not before our craftsman heard Edmund mutter something about power of attorney and mental competence. The pieces were falling into place now, forming a picture that chilled despite the warm morning. In the bathroom, our craftsman made a disturbing discovery. Someone had installed a secondary valve system hidden behind the marble wainscoting. The work was amateur but clever. A bypass that could allow contaminated water to flow regardless of his telltales on the main valves. More troubling still, he found traces of what appeared to be additional substances near this hidden valve, a reddish powder that wasn't rust. Something added to enhance the bloody appearance of the water. Margaret appeared while he was examining this evidence. Her face had the drawn look of someone who hadn't slept properly in days. "I need to show you something," she said quietly, glancing over her shoulder to ensure they were alone. She led him to her small office, a converted dressing room where she managed Lady Ashworth's correspondence. From a locked drawer, she produced a document that made our craftsman's blood run cold. A draft certification of mental incompetence, partially completed, awaiting only a physician's signature and witness statements. "I found it in Edmund's studio," she whispered, "hidden beneath his sketches." He means to have her declared unfit before she can leave for Italy. Once she's gone, he loses any chance of controlling the estate until her death. But if she's declared incompetent while still in England... The implications were staggering. The crimson water wasn't meant to prevent the journey. It was meant to provide evidence of Lady Ashworth's deteriorating mental state. Every hysterical reaction, every claim of supernatural warning, was being carefully orchestrated and likely documented. "There's more," Margaret continued, her voice barely audible. "Edmund has been in correspondence with a Dr. Marsh, a specialist in nervous disorders, who has a reputation for flexibility in his diagnoses. For the right price, he'll swear to anything." Our craftsman studied the document, his mind racing. The legal language was precise, clinical, describing Lady Ashworth's persistent delusions regarding contaminated water and hysterical episodes triggered by innocuous stimuli. It painted a picture of a woman divorced from reality, unable to manage her own affairs.
"Why show me this?" he asked, though he suspected he knew the answer. Margaret's composure finally cracked. "Because I can't stop him alone. I've tried reasoning with him, pleading, even threatening to expose him, but he knows that I care too much to truly hurt him. He's counting on my weakness." Through the window they could see Edmund in the garden below, speaking intently with a man our craftsman didn't recognize, well-dressed, carrying a medical bag. But something about his bearing suggested charlatan rather than healer. Dr. Marsh, presumably, come to observe the patient in her natural habitat. "We need proof," our craftsman said, his mind already formulating a plan. "Undeniable evidence of the manipulation."
Something that would stand up to legal scrutiny. Margaret nodded, hope flickering in her eyes for the first time. "Lady Ashworth's bath is scheduled for 8 o'clock tonight. She insists on maintaining her routine despite everything. Edmund knows this, of course." The afternoon passed in careful preparation. Our craftsman installed hidden markers throughout the system, including a new innovation, a valve that would trap a sample of water at the moment of contamination, preserving evidence of whatever was being added to enhance the effect. He also positioned small mirrors at strategic angles, allowing observation of the hidden valve system from a concealed vantage point. As evening approached, the household settled into its familiar rhythms. Dinner was served, Lady Ashworth picking at her food while discussing the medicinal properties of various Italian springs. Edmund sat opposite her, his attention seemingly focused on his wine. But our craftsman noticed how his eyes flickered to the clock every few minutes. At 7:45, our craftsman took his position in a service corridor that provided access to both the bathroom and the hidden valve system. Margaret waited in the bathroom itself, preparing Lady Ashworth's bath with ostentatious normalcy. The trap was set. The night of November 2nd descended upon Belgrave Square with unusual stillness, as though London itself held its breath. Our craftsman had spent the previous 2 days perfecting his observation system, creating what amounted to a mechanical trap that would catch the perpetrator in the very act. He'd told Pemberton he needed to monitor the pipes overnight for pressure fluctuations. A thin excuse, but the butler had accepted it with a knowing nod that suggested he understood more than he let on. The servants' quarters had settled into sleep by 11 o'clock, leaving the great house to its ghosts and secrets. Our craftsman positioned himself in a narrow service passage that ran between the walls, a space originally designed for Victorian servants to move unseen. From here, through the system of mirrors he'd installed, he could observe both the bathroom and the approaches to the hidden valve system. The house at night was a different creature than during the day. It breathed and settled, timbers creaking with the stories they held. Somewhere above, he could hear footsteps, too heavy for Lady Ashworth, too measured for servants. Edmund, perhaps, pacing his studio as he often did when insomnia struck. At 11:30, our craftsman heard the distinctive click of a door latch being carefully lifted. Through his mirrors, he saw a figure moving through the shadows. Edmund, dressed in a smoking jacket, carrying a small leather case. But then, unexpectedly, another figure appeared from the opposite direction. Margaret Thornley, wrapped in a dark shawl, her face pale in the gaslight that filtered through the windows. They met near the hidden valve system, and our craftsman adjusted his position to better observe. What he witnessed then was not what he'd expected, not collusion, but confrontation. "I won't let you do this again," Margaret whispered fiercely.
She's leaving in 8 days. Can't you simply let her go?" Edmund's laugh was bitter. "Let her go? She's taking £300 to pour into the pockets of Italian quacks. Money that could settle my debts, establish me properly, give me a life beyond being her perpetual invalid son." "You're not an invalid," Margaret protested. "You're brilliant, talented. You could make your own way if you'd only try." "With what capital? What connections? Mother has spent 26 years ensuring I need her for everything."
Now, when I finally have a chance to reverse our positions, you want me to abandon it? Our craftsman watched as Edmund opened his case, revealing not just the reddish powder he'd discovered earlier, but several vials of different substances. The young man's hands moved with practiced efficiency, measuring and mixing with the precision of a chemist. "This is wrong, Edmund." Margaret's voice broke. "What you're doing? It's not just controlling her money. You're destroying her mind. The fear is eating her alive." "Good," Edmund said coldly. "Let her taste what it's like to be afraid of everything, to see disaster lurking in every corner. She's fed on my fears for years, keeping me close by convincing me I'm too weak for the world. Now she can choke on her own medicine." Margaret reached for the case, but Edmund caught her wrist. For a moment they struggled silently, and our craftsman prepared to intervene. But then Margaret pulled free, stumbling backward. "I've written to her solicitor," she said breathlessly. "If anything happens to prevent her journey, if she's declared incompetent, I've instructed him to investigate." Edmund went very still. "You wouldn't dare. You love me." "I did," Margaret replied, and the past tense hung between them like a blade. "But I've watched you become something monstrous. Your mother's fears may have shaped you, but your choices have defined you." She turned to leave, but Edmund's next word stopped her. "I know about Manchester, the position you've taken. Do you think the Harrowells would want a governess who helped forge documents? Who participated in fraud?" Our craftsman's blood ran cold. He hadn't known Margaret was involved to that extent, though looking back he should have suspected. Who else had the knowledge and access to create convincing medical documents? "I forged nothing," Margaret said steadily. "I copied documents you asked me to copy before I understood their purpose. The moment I realized what you intended, I refused to help further. A distinction that would be lost on your future employers, I think." The threat hung in the air, but Margaret straightened her shoulders. "Then I'll find other employment. Better to be honestly poor than complicit in this cruelty." She left then, her footsteps fading into the house's darkness. Edmund remained, his hands still on his case of chemicals. Our craftsman watched as the young man's shoulders began to shake, not with laughter, but with what appeared to be sobs. The sight was unsettling, this glimpse of genuine emotion beneath the calculating exterior. Edmund composed himself eventually, approaching the hidden valve system with renewed purpose. But as he reached for the valve, he hesitated. His hand trembled, and for a moment our craftsman thought he might abandon the plan. Then, with what seemed like enormous effort, Edmund opened the valve and began adding his chemicals to the system. The precision was remarkable. He knew exactly how much to add, how long to let it circulate, when to close the valve to ensure the contamination would appear at the right moment. This wasn't amateur work. Edmund had studied, practiced, perfected his technique. The dedication would have been admirable if applied to any other purpose.
As Edmund prepared to leave, he paused, speaking to the darkness. "I know you're there," he said quietly, "whoever you are. The new scratches on the pipes, the mirrors that weren't here yesterday. You're watching." Our craftsman held perfectly still, not even breathing. "It doesn't matter," Edmund continued. "By the time Mother takes her morning bath, she'll have another episode. Dr. Marsh will witness it, declare her unfit, and I'll finally be free. Both of us will be free, really. She can stop pretending to be ill, and I can stop pretending to be well." He left then, taking his case with him. Our craftsman waited a full quarter hour before emerging from his hiding place. His hands shook slightly as he opened the sample valve he'd installed, capturing proof of the contamination. But even with this evidence, he faced a dilemma. Exposing Edmund would destroy the family, ruin Margaret's prospects, and possibly push Lady Ashworth over the edge she was already teetering upon. In his pocket, the letter about his wife's grave seemed to burn. He thought about the choices that led to endings, his wife's quiet acceptance of her fate, his own inability to save her, despite all his skills with pipes and pressure. Now here he was again, holding the power to save or destroy, and once again feeling inadequate to the task. The morning of November 5th dawned gray and bitter, fitting weather for what our craftsman knew must be done. He had spent the remaining hours of the night in sleepless contemplation, turning over the evidence in his hands like a magistrate weighing souls. The sample of contaminated water sat in a sealed jar in his tool bag, alongside the careful documentation he'd compiled. Yet he found himself walking not to the authorities, but back to Belgrave Square, drawn by an instinct he couldn't quite name. He arrived to find the household in chaos. Lady Ashworth had taken her morning bath earlier than usual, and as Edmund had promised, the water had run crimson. But this time, something had gone wrong. The contamination was too strong, the color too vivid, and Lady Ashworth had collapsed entirely, requiring Dr. Headley's immediate attention. The legitimate doctor, not the charlatan Marsh, who had apparently been turned away at the door by a surprisingly forceful Pemberton. Our craftsman found Edmund in the morning room, standing at the window with the rigid posture of a man awaiting execution. The young man didn't turn when he entered, but spoke to the glass. "She's dying, you know. Not from the water, from the fear. Her heart can't take much more." His voice carried no triumph, only a hollow exhaustion. "I've won, and in winning, I've lost everything." "You could stop," our craftsman said simply. "Tell them the truth, the contamination, the plan, everything." Edmund's laugh was brittle. "And go to prison? Lose not just the money, but my freedom? You don't understand what it's like, being trapped between dependency and desperation." Our craftsman thought of his wife's final days, how she'd depended on him for everything while he'd been desperate to save her. Perhaps he understood more than Edmund knew. "There's another way," he said, producing the sealed jar from his bag. "I have proof of what you've done, enough to destroy you completely. But I also have a proposition." Edmund finally turned, his face haggard beyond his years. The handsome features that echoed his mother's were drawn with sleepless anxiety. "You want money, of course." "Everyone wants money." "I want resolution," our craftsman corrected. "For everyone. Your mother needs to take her Italian journey. It might be the only thing that saves her now.
giving her distance from this poisoned house. You need to find your own path, away from her shadow and your mutual destruction. And Margaret needs to leave with her reputation intact. Margaret. The name seemed to pain him. She was here last night. You saw. It wasn't a question, and our craftsman didn't deny it. They stood facing each other, two men from different worlds brought together by pipes and circumstance. "Here's what will happen," our craftsman said with quiet authority. "I will permanently seal the old system, properly this time, with no hidden valves or secret connections. The crimson water will never appear again. You will support your mother's journey, even encourage it. In her absence, you'll seek legitimate employment. Use your artistic talents for something productive. Commission work, perhaps, or teaching." "And if I refuse?" Our craftsman hefted the jar meaningfully. "Then Dr. Headley receives this sample, along with my detailed observations. He's an honest man who cares for your mother. He'll do what's necessary to protect her." Edmund sank into a chair, suddenly looking very young. "You don't know what it's been like. Every day feeling her watching me for signs of my father's weakness. He died of consumption, you know. Same disease that took your wife." Our craftsman started. He hadn't realized Edmund knew about his personal loss. "Oh yes, I investigated you," Edmund continued wearily, "when you first arrived. I investigate everyone who gets close to Mother. It's one of my many useless talents. You lost her 2 years ago this December, Sarah, wasn't it? 28 years old?" "Buried in Kensal Green, without a proper marker, because you spent everything on doctors who couldn't save her." The words should have stung, but instead they created an unexpected bridge between them. Here were two men marked by loss, shaped by circumstances beyond their control, making choices that led them deeper into darkness. "The marker matters," our craftsman said quietly. "Not to her. She's beyond caring. But to me, it says she existed, that she was loved, that someone remembers. Your mother needs something similar, not a gravestone, but recognition that her fears, however exaggerated, come from real pain." Edmund was quiet for a long moment, then asked, "How do you know I won't simply resume once you're gone?" "Because Margaret won't let you. Because Pemberton is watching now, understanding more than you realize. Because Alice has been documenting things in her own way. And because," our craftsman paused, choosing his words carefully, "I believe you're tired of being the villain in your own story." Their conversation was interrupted by Margaret entering with tea. She looked between them, understanding immediately that some negotiation had taken place. Her face showed relief mixed with apprehension. "Lady Ashworth is asking for you both," she said carefully. "She's recovered somewhat and wants to discuss the plumbing situation." They found her propped up in bed, looking frailer than our craftsman had ever seen her. But her eyes held a clarity that suggested the morning's shock had burned through some of her perpetual fog of anxiety. "I've been thinking," she said without preamble, "about water. How it can be pure or poisoned, clear or clouded. But it's still water, still necessary for life." She looked directly at Edmund. "I know you hate me." "Mother," Edmund began, but she raised her hand. "I've made you weak by seeing weakness everywhere. I've made you dependent by fearing independence. I've created the very thing I most feared, a son who resents me." Tears tracked down her cheeks, but her voice remained steady. "The water runs red because our house is sick. Not the pipes. Us." Our craftsman recognized his moment. "My lady, I can guarantee the water will run clear from now on. The old system will be completely sealed with no possibility of contamination. You can take your journey with complete confidence." She studied him carefully, and he saw intelligence in her gaze that her hypochondria usually obscured. "Can you guarantee my son will be well in my absence?" It was Edmund who answered, "I'll try, mother. It's all I can promise, that I'll try." The rest of the day passed in careful choreography. Our craftsmen worked with genuine purpose now, sealing every connection between old and new with lead and certainty. Edmund helped, his hands steady as he held pipes in place, a symbolic participation in closing off the path he'd created. November 8th arrived with the first proper frost of the season, transforming Belgrave Square into something from a fairy tale, all crystalline edges and silvered surfaces. Our craftsman arrived early for what would be his final day of work at the Ashworth mansion. The past 3 days had seen remarkable transformations, not just in the plumbing, which now ran clear as mountain streams, but in the household itself. Lady Ashworth had taken to having her morning bath with something approaching pleasure rather than dread. The crimson water had not returned, and with each clear, pure filling of the marble tub, her confidence grew. She'd even begun to speak of Italy with genuine anticipation rather than desperate hope, describing the journey as an adventure rather than a medical necessity. Edmund had been true to his word after his fashion. He'd written to several art dealers about taking commissions, and Margaret had quietly helped him prepare a portfolio of his better works. The young man still carried his bitterness like a stone in his chest, but he was learning to work around it rather than be crushed beneath it. This morning, our craftsman found Pemberton in the butler's pantry, polishing the silver tea service with unusual vigor. The butler looked up at his approach, and something passed between them, an acknowledgement of shared knowledge, carefully unspoken. "The household is grateful for your discretion," Pemberton said carefully, his attention seemingly focused on a particularly stubborn tarnish spot. "Both for what you've repaired and what you've chosen not to damage." Our craftsman nodded, understanding the weight of what wasn't being said. In houses like this, Pemberton had explained once, the butler's primary duty was to maintain order, not just in the running of the household, but in the careful balance of secrets that kept such establishments functioning. "Alice's brother," Pemberton continued, still polishing, "I understand you've recommended him to Mr. Hartwell's household. They're very pleased with his work. Alice is grateful." Indeed, Alice had expressed her gratitude that very morning, slipping our craftsman a small package wrapped in brown paper. Inside was a simple brass picture frame, nothing expensive, but polished to a mirror shine. "For your wife's photograph," she'd said simply, before disappearing back into the servants' hall. The final seal on the old cistern system required our craftsmen to work in the attic one last time. The space felt different now, less menacing, more melancholic. The massive tank sat silent and defeated, its decades of collecting rain and rust finally at an end. As he welded the final joints, permanently closing off every possible connection, he thought about endings and beginnings, about how sometimes destroying something was the only way to save what mattered. Margaret found him there as he was packing his tools. She looked different, lighter somehow, as though a weight had been lifted from her shoulders.
Her traveling dress suggested she was ready for departure, though her boat to Manchester didn't leave until evening. "I wanted to thank you," she said simply. "Not just for what you've done, but for how you've done it. Another man might have handled things differently." Our craftsman thought about the jar of contaminated water still in his possession, evidence that could destroy lives with a single revelation. "We all make choices," he said. "The trick is making ones we can live with." She smiled, an expression both sad and hopeful.
"Edmund asked me to give you this." She handed him an envelope, heavy with what felt like coins. "It's from his personal funds, not his mother's. He said to tell you it's not payment for silence, but recognition of wisdom." Before our craftsman could respond, a commotion arose from below. Lady Ashworth's voice, but not in distress. Instead, she sounded almost girlish with excitement. They descended to find her in the entrance hall, surrounded by luggage, dressed in traveling clothes that made her look years younger. "The water ran perfectly clear again this morning," she announced to the assembled household. "I take it as a sign. The house is blessing my journey." She turned to our craftsman. "You've not just fixed our plumbing. You've restored my faith that problems can be solved, that things can be made right." If she knew the full truth of what had been made right, she gave no sign. Perhaps, our craftsman thought, there were different kinds of knowing, and Lady Ashworth had chosen the version that would allow her to move forward. Edmund appeared, dressed more formally than usual, to bid his mother farewell. The embrace they shared was awkward, stilted with years of mutual damage. But it was real. "Try to enjoy yourself, Mother," he said quietly. "Try to be well." "Try to be yourself," she replied, touching his cheek gently. "The real you, not the one I've made you think you should be." The carriage arrived, and the household gathered to see her off. Even Cook emerged from her kitchen, flour still dusting her apron. As the carriage pulled away, Lady Ashworth waved from the window, looking for all the world like someone escaping prison rather than leaving home. The household dispersed, each returning to their duties. But Edmund lingered with our craftsman on the steps. "She'll be gone 2 months," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "Long enough to prove I can manage without her, or to prove I can't. Which do you think it will be?" Edmund almost smiled. 6 days ago, I would have said I couldn't. Now I think I might surprise myself, and her." He paused, then added, "The water will stay clear, as long as the seals hold," our craftsman assured him. "And I build things to last." They shook hands then, formally. Two men who had seen each other at their worst and chosen not to exploit that knowledge. Edmund returned to the house, and our craftsman heard him calling for Margaret, something about reviewing the household accounts properly this time. The afternoon was spent in final inspections, checking every joint, every valve, every connection one last time. The system was perfect now, not just functional, but elegant, a harmony of pressures and flows that would serve the house for decades to come. As he made his final notes, Pemberton appeared with an envelope. "From Her Ladyship," he said. "Left with instructions to give it to you upon completion of the work." Inside was a bank draft for considerably more than the agreed price, along with a note in Lady Ashworth's spidery hand. "For excellent work and exceptional discretion, please use the excess for whatever personal matter weighs upon you. We all have our ghosts that need proper burial." Our craftsman stood in the November afternoon, the weight of the past week settling on his shoulders like snow. He thought about the letter in his pocket about Sarah's grave,
about the frame Alice had given him, about the money that would now allow him to give his wife the memorial she deserved. A week had passed since Lady Ashworth's departure for Italy, and November 15th brought London one of those rare autumn days when the sun remembered its purpose. Our craftsman stood in Kensal Green Cemetery, watching the stonemason put finishing touches on a modest but dignified headstone.
Sarah Elizabeth Hartley, it read, beloved wife, 1856 to 1882, her love flows on. The metaphor of water seemed appropriate now, after everything. The excess payment from Lady Ashworth had covered not just the stone, but also perpetual care for the plot, ensuring that spring flowers would bloom here long after he himself was gone. He placed the framed photograph Alice had helped him prepare against the stone, Sarah in their small garden, laughing at something he could no longer remember, captured in a moment when consumption was just a word, not yet a thief. Strange how fixing other people's problems could sometimes illuminate solutions to one's own. The Ashworth household had taught him that water, like truth, always finds its way to the surface eventually. The question was whether you'd channel it properly or let it destroy everything in its path. That morning, a letter had arrived from Italy, forwarded through Pemberton with typical efficiency. Lady Ashworth wrote with enthusiasm about the thermal baths of Montecatini, how the mineral waters tasted of iron and earth, how the Italian sun seemed to burn away years of London fog from her lungs. The water here sometimes runs reddish from the natural minerals, she wrote, but rather than frightening me, it seems almost friendly now, like encountering an old adversary who has become, through understanding, something of a friend. She made no direct mention of what had transpired before her departure, but her postscript spoke volumes. Edmund writes that he has taken his first commission, a portrait for a merchant family. He sounds different in his letters, clearer somehow, like water that has finally been allowed to settle. Our craftsman had returned to Belgrave Square once since the departure, summoned by Pemberton to examine a minor leak in the kitchen. The house felt different without Lady Ashworth's anxious presence, not abandoned, but rather exhaling after holding its breath too long. He'd found Edmund in his studio, actually working this time, paint under his fingernails, and a look of concentration that suggested genuine engagement rather than mere performance. "The water still runs clear," Edmund had said without looking up from his canvas. "I check sometimes, just to be sure. It's become something of a meditation, watching clear water fill the basin, remembering what it cost to muddy it, what it cost to clean it again." Margaret had left for Manchester as planned, but not before securing a promise from Edmund that he would write. Not love letters, but simple correspondence between friends who had weathered a storm together. She'd left a note for our craftsman with Pemberton. "Truth is like water. It can be diverted, contaminated, hidden, but never destroyed. Thank you for helping us find a cleaner source." Now, standing in the cemetery, our craftsman reflected on how the events at Belgrave Square had changed his understanding of his craft. Plumbing, he'd always thought, was about controlling water, making it go where you wanted, when you wanted. But perhaps it was really about understanding water's nature and working with it rather than against it. The same might be said of people and their secrets. Alice's brother had sent word that his new position was going well, that the Hartwell household was kind and fair. Alice herself had been promoted to upper housemaid, her keen observation skills finally recognized and rewarded. Even Pemberton seemed lighter,
no longer carrying the weight of willful blindness to the household's dysfunction. The stonemason finished his work and departed with a respectful nod, leaving our craftsman alone with his memories and the November afternoon.
He thought about the hidden valve in the Ashworth bathroom, now sealed behind new plaster and paint. A secret literally buried in the walls. Some might call it concealment of a crime, but he preferred to think of it as foundation repair, fixing the underlying damage so the house could stand straight again. A movement caught his eye. An elderly woman at a nearby grave, arranging chrysanthemums with practiced care. She noticed him watching and offered a small smile of solidarity, one mourner to another. "Gets easier," she said simply. "Never goes away, but gets easier to carry." He thanked her for the wisdom and turned for one last look at Sarah's stone. The brass frame Alice had given him caught the afternoon light, making the photograph seem to glow. Yes, water flowed on, carrying sediment and memory, contamination and clarity in equal measure. The trick was not to stop its flow, but to ensure it ran clean enough to sustain life, rather than poison it. Walking back through London toward his workshop, our craftsman passed the construction site of one of the new Metropolitan Board of Works pumping stations, part of the grand scheme to give London proper sewerage and clean water for all. He paused to watch the workers laying massive pipes, each one a promise that the city's future would be cleaner than its past. There was honor in such work, in being part of the great project of civilization, one joint, one seal, one clear-running tap at a time. His workshop, when he reached it, felt welcoming in a way it hadn't for months. The tools gleamed on their racks, each one a faithful companion in the daily work of making things function properly. On his desk lay new commissions. Word of his discretion and skill had spread through the subtle networks of London's wealthy. The Ashworth name carried weight, and Lady Ashworth's recommendation had opened doors throughout Belgravia and Mayfair. But it was a simpler job that drew his attention. A request from a boarding house in Whitechapel to repair their communal pump. The payment would be modest, but there was something appealing about returning to straightforward work, where water was just water, not a metaphor for family dysfunction or a weapon in psychological warfare. As evening fell, he lit his lamp and began preparing for tomorrow's work, cleaning tools, checking supplies, reviewing the simple blueprints of the Whitechapel pump. Outside, London went about its evening routines, workers heading home, street lamps being lit, the great city settling into another night of dreams and secrets. He thought once more of the Ashworth household, each member now flowing in their own direction like water finding its natural level. Lady Ashworth taking the cure in Italy, Edmund learning to paint for money rather than spite, Margaret teaching Manchester children their letters, Alice rising through service with her keen eyes wide open. Even the house itself seemed to have found peace, its pipes running clear, its secrets safely sealed behind marble and respectability. Water, our craftsman concluded as he closed his shop for the night, was perhaps the perfect medium for understanding human nature. It could be pure or polluted, violent or calm, hidden or revealed. It took the shape of whatever contained it. It had the power to wear away the strongest stone, given time. Most importantly, it was necessary for life. Not the life we might wish for, but the life we actually lived, with all its compromises, kindnesses, and small victories over the darkness that always threatened to seep in through the cracks. The crimson waters of Belgrave Square had run clear at last, and in fixing them, perhaps he'd fixed something in himself as well. The understanding that
Sometimes, the greatest skill lay not in perfection, but in knowing which imperfections could be lived with, and which ones would poison everything they touched. Tomorrow he would return to his work, carrying this wisdom in his hands and heart, ready to channel whatever waters needed channeling, clear or crimson, pure or compromised, but always, always flowing towards something better than before.